The building relationships, introverts do that beautifully. In fact, it happens a lot more in depth than, let's say, at a cocktail party where, the real networking doesn't really happen there, right? It happens in making intentional connections with people and just continuing to do that. And that's how your career can get ahead. So, that's just one example of how you can flip the script and move forward.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the KTS Success Factor podcast for women, where we talk about challenges senior female leaders face in being happy and successful at work. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah E. Brown. My guest today is Jennifer Kahnweiler Ph.D. An author and global speaker. She has been hailed as a champion for introverts. Her best-selling books, The Introverted Leader, Quiet Influence, The Genius of Opposites, and her latest book, Creating Introvert-Friendly Workplaces, have been translated into 18 languages and have helped to shape the conversation about introverted leadership. Jennifer has worked as a consultant, learning and development leader, and keynote speaker at such organizations as NASA, the American Chemical Society, Merck Pharmaceuticals, Bosch, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, Freddie Mac, and Kimberly-Clark. She's been invited to deliver programs around the world virtually and on-site in many countries, including Australia, Vietnam, Japan, Germany, and Paraguay. She has been featured in such news outlets as the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Fortune, Forbes, and Time magazine. Her book, The Introverted Leader, was named one of the top 5 business books by the Shanghai Daily. Jennifer received her PhD in counseling and organization development from Florida State University, psychology and counseling from Washington University in St. Louis. She has served on the boards of Barrett Kohler Authors, Inc., the BK Global Task Force, and was the vice president of the National Speakers Association of Georgia, and serves as a mentor to many professional women. Jennifer holds the Certified Speaking Professional, an honor given to a very small percentage of professional speakers. A native New Yorker, Jennifer now calls Atlanta, Georgia, home. Welcome, Jennifer.
Sarah, it's my pleasure to be here today. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure as well, speaking as an introvert. So what is the biggest challenge you're helping female leaders face in business today? And what would you say are the symptoms of that challenge?
Well, what I have found in working primarily with introverted leaders, many of whom are female, is that it's a belief, Sarah, that a leader has to look a certain way. It's the extroverted, charisma, out there, outgoing leader. And so I've had many introverted female leaders say to me, well, I could never be that. I can't go for leadership in my company. And the symptoms of that is that we live particularly in our Western society and our organizations in this part of the world, and where I live in the United States, and other Western countries, there's a type A extroverted ideal, if you will, for the way you're supposed to be as a leader. And that's absolutely not true, but many of us have bought into that. And unfortunately, that really sabotages the goals and the desires of many females.
So what are the biggest mistakes your clients make before they start working with you?
Well, when I think about, individual clients, there's probably, I have 2 buckets that I work with. I work with individuals, but I primarily work with groups and, facilitate groups and trainings and group coaching and both virtually and live. And the constant themes that come up, and I understand totally why this happens, but I'll stick with introverted female leaders, since that is kind of my niche, or what do they say in Europe, niche, I think, and in Canada, is basically a lack. One of the big mistakes is a lack of visibility, that we think, and many of us as women do this, that we think if we work hard and not smart, then we're going to get promoted. People are going to notice that. But in fact, in this kind of a world that I described that's so busy and where there's so much going on, many leaders who are actually looking for people to promote or to, put on a fast track or any kind of a track, if they don't see or hear about what you're doing and what results you're getting, you can really get lost behind. And that leads to a lot of frustration. And particularly with, it's even more than that, particularly with introverts, they will check out and disengage. And you've worked in talent management, that's kind of the silent problem that we have, right? We never even know about the unhappiness until they leave. That's one thing. And another big mistake that I see is that negative impressions, are from the outside really do affect us. I talked about sort of that message that you should be an extroverted leader. Well, there are a lot of problems the way the people have so much bias against introverts in the working world. And so, and outside as well, and I always bring in my personal stories too when I give talks. And one of them I write about my husband Bill, who's a really introvert and I'm more extroverted, which was very helpful to learn early on in our relationship. But when he would go back to his cave or his side of the tiny apartment we had when we were first married, I would take it personally. I say, what's wrong with him? Why is he not talking to me? Well, not realizing that he needed time to recharge. But if you amplify that kind of negative impression on many levels, like somebody doesn't speak up in a meeting, they have nothing to say, or they don't go out with people at lunch because they need a break, right? Sarah, didn't you find that? Mm-hmm. Like you wouldn't want to socialize, right? Those impressions last in a culture that can be kind of damaging to your career. So I think of, knowing that you can then deal with it. And there's one other one that I've seen come up a lot, and that is that we assume, and we're all guilty of this, is like we get busy working and we put aside the need to build relationships. Mm-hmm. And I think with the last few months that we've been experienced with the pandemic and people being home, I think we're realizing how important it is for connection, that we can't just, have these large scale Zoom meetings. So all of these things can be addressed, and particularly from the introvert strength perspective, by like, for instance, the building relationships. Introverts do that beautifully. In fact, it happens a lot more in depth than, let's say, at a cocktail party where, the real networking doesn't really happen there, right? It happens mm-hmm. in making intentional connections with people and just continuing to do that. And that's how your career can get ahead. So, that's just one example of how you can flip the script and move mm-hmm. forward.
Mm-hmm. What is the number one free and actionable tip you can give introverted women who might be listening here to address this challenge now?
I think that the tip that I would think about here is it's really right in front of our eyes, and that's to be curious and to observe. I think when I became a parent, I remember I was reading all the parenting books, and some wise woman who was older, who was a mentor for me, she said, your kids are going to remember they're going to remember not what you say, but what you do. And so I started to watch what other parents were doing, right? To see who I liked, who I felt like their kids were coming out okay so far, and I said, wow, that's really important to look at other role models. And I did that just intuitively in organizations. Like our best lessons, right, come from observing those role models. So like how that woman who is a leader who you admire quietly, gets her point across in a very forceful way, and makes a difference, how she does it, the body language, all of the things that she does, we can learn from that. And she, in fact, might not even know that you're using her as a role model, or you might want to ask her for some mentoring. But I think it's so powerful when we just look around and select those people who we admire and adopt some of the behaviors and actions that they incorporate and that they exude. And I think that's probably the freest tip that I can offer without, purchasing anything.
Let me take that one step further if I could, because you mentioned not going to lunch because you needed to recharge or otherwise stepping back. Is there something introverts can do to make that better understood?
Oh, to make it better understood with the extroverts, you mean, and the team members? Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And that is another challenge that introverts have, is actually talking about the elephant in the room, right? And maybe you could speak to that too, Sarah, just like naming it and saying, I don't know if or, I'm more introverted. I have this, real need to, after I'm with you, you think I'm very social. And by the way, a lot of leaders and female leaders are mistaken for extroverts. I don't know if you had that happen too, but, because you've developed those social skills. So you're saying, well, I just really need a break. I need at lunchtime and I've had this happen actually in groups that I facilitated, that teams would say to each other, I want you to know that when I go in my office, when there used to be offices, or I go off by myself, or I'm not answering your phone when you call me at home, is because I am recharging. And that's when I do my best work, when I've had that chance to come out into the world again. And people say, oh, really? And there's usually no negative. It's just naming what you need. And so that's one tip that I would say. It's like we each need to share that, and I did research on introverts and extroverts, and really what makes those partnerships work. When I wrote The Genius of Opposites, I found that it wasn't anything magic. It was just us telling each other what we needed and being willing to accept that we're not going to change that other person. And that's the key too, right?
One of the things that I do talk with a lot of my clients about is the importance of expressing your needs. And,
yes.
and doing it in a way that you're not putting a burden on somebody else. You're just explaining who you are, and it actually is helpful to both parties. So,
right, and both parties, by the way, Sarah, should share. I mean, the extrovert too. Speaking as an extrovert, you need time to just sort of download. Extroverts will tell you, I need time to just. You don't even need to react. I just need you to listen. And by the way, introverts are such great listeners oftentimes that it's a very good combination. But each side of the equation, just like on a team, we have to say what we need. There's actually an interesting tool. You talk about free tools that I learned about that Google started using, and other companies are too, which is called a user guide. And this really fits the introvert too, where you write down your preferences and what you like and dislike and what you prefer as far as communication style, et cetera. And then you share that with the team. So simply doing that, I don't know if you've experienced that, but it makes such a difference in how the team functions.
Well, I'm going to go research the Google's user guide.
Put it in there.
Yeah, because I'm not familiar with that, but I am familiar with sharing that. So that is a really good, free, valuable resource. Are there others you might want to mention?
Well, I would love to have people come visit my website and I have quizzes on my website that are all free.
Cool.
Yeah. And each quiz has been developed in coordination or in alignment with the books that I have written. So this is the fourth one, as you mentioned, Creating Introvert-Friendly Workplaces. But since we're talking about, we can stick on that one. There is a quiz that actually you can take. It's only about 5 minutes. You can get the results right then. And it tells you sort of where your organization, from your standpoint, is doing well to support introverts. And you could answer it from the standpoint of your team as well. For instance, you're allowing people to engage, be heard in meetings. You're structuring workspace so that there's space for introverts to have privacy, these kinds of things. Those are on the quiz. And there's also ones on introverted leadership, et cetera, if you're curious about that as well. So I think that's probably the most powerful quiz, tool that I have. And then I did have an article that I'll share with you on this too, Sarah, that I wrote back in 2013, but I was looking at it before we spoke, and it was written for Lean In, which had just started then. And it's all about how introverted women what they specifically can do to succeed. So I'll share that with your audience as well.
Okay, that's great. And I will put this in the show notes so that they know how to get to your website and a link to the article. That's great. So what, Jennifer, is one question I should have asked you about this topic that will help my audience take action to address it for herself?
Well, I always laugh when I see should, because I say, don't should on yourself. I always think about that. You asked me fabulous questions. But one question that you might have asked that you didn't might be this one. How can women be allies for each other? Because particularly now with all of the awareness of social unrest, et cetera, now's the time for us really. This is not a nice to have anymore. I mean, what we were sharing before the podcast is, the numbers have inched up so incrementally. In some cases, they have gone down for women of color rising up in organizations. And one of the keys to this, I firmly believe this, is for us to support each other in very tangible ways. I think we are. I think women are. But I think some of the things we can do is specifically, number one, bring up the lack of female diversity every chance you get. So, I was asked to be on a panel a few months ago, and I just looked through the program guide, and I was just shocked to find how few women were there. And I, of course, was the only woman on the panel. I don't say of course, but I'm sure you've been there, Sarah, too. But bringing that up, and it might be too late to change it for that conference, but for the next one, they need to be on guard, on point with this and be accountable. And so if nobody's speaking up, it's going to just stay the same. Number two, refer and recommend other women for positions of influence, for opportunities that you hear coming up, and just have that on your radar. And I would also add to that women of color, because again, they have a special need to be recognized, and we don't always think of all of the ranges of women in our midst. And number three, I think we need to bring senior leaders into the conversation, women and men who are advocates and allies for gender diversity and all kinds of diversity. And it is so impressive to me and so powerful when I hear women like you tell their story, and let's say talk about like a Caroline McGregor, who I interviewed in the book and who I was so impressed with from Merck, a senior leader who went around the company talking about how introversion had shaped her, the challenges, and how she overcame those challenges, and how she uses those strengths to succeed as an executive at this company. And that, again, listening to people who are doing it, watching them, is so incredibly impactful to so many millions of people. So those three things, I'd bring up the lack of female diversity, I refer other women, and bring senior women into the conversation. And I think that would be the positive steps to take.
That's great. What an inspiring message. Jennifer, thank you so much for being my guest.
It was my pleasure, and I applaud you for your mission and the work that you're doing. It's really inspiring.
Thanks for listening to the KTS Success Factor podcast for women. If you like what you are hearing, please go to iTunes to subscribe, rate us, and leave a review. And if you would like more information on how we can help women in your organization to thrive, then go to www.sarahebrown.com. You can sign up for our newsletter, read show notes, and learn more about our podcast guests, read my blog, browse through the books, or contact us for a chat. Goodbye for now.